So the passage I have prepared for you today is a passage from Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, where he is criticizing his opponent in the presidential election, Mr. Wilson, and all his ideas. I'll read it to you aloud, and then we'll analyze everything later in the question and answer section. Ignore the highlighted sections for now. I will explain what that all means later. So the difference between Mr. Wilson and myself is fundamental. The other day in a speech at Sioux Falls, Mr. Wilson stated his position when he said that the history of government, the history of liberty, was the history of the limitation of governmental power. This is true as an academic statement of history in the past. It is not true as a statement affecting the present. It is true of the history of medieval Europe. It is not true of the history of 20th century America. So what is Mr. Roosevelt kind of doing in this first paragraph? He's kind of setting up his argument. He states that his position, right, of Mr. Wilson is that of the history of government and the history of liberty. So he's giving the reader a sense of establishment in order to front-run his next arguments. Next, he goes, in the days when all government power exists exclusively in the king or in the baronage, and when the people had no shred of that power in their own hand, then it undoubtedly was true that the history of liberty was the history of the limitation of governmental power of the outsiders who possessed the power. But today, the people have actually or potentially the entire government power. It is theirs to use and to exercise if they choose to use and exercise it. It offers the only adequate instrument with which they can work for the betterment, for the uplifting, for the masses of our people. So in the second paragraph, Mr. Roosevelt kind of continues his argument, and he kind of starts his upheaval of Mr. Wilson's argument. Next, he starts, the liberty of which Mr. Wilson speaks today means merely the liberty of some great trust magnate to do that which he is not entitled to do. It means merely the liberty of some factory owner to work haggard woman over 4 hours for underpay, and himself to pocket the proceeds. It means the liberty of the factory owner who crowds his operatives into some crazy death trap on the top floor where if fire starts, the slaughter is immense. It means the liberty of the big factory owner who is conscienceless and unscrupulous to work his men and women under the conditions which eat into their lives like acid. It means the liberty of even less conscientious factory owners to make their money out of the toil, the labor of little children. Men of this stamp are the men whose liberty would be preserved by Mr. Wilson. Men of this stamp are the men whose liberty would be preserved by the limitation of governmental power. So, Mr. Roosevelt continues to eat into Mr. Wilson's argument, and this time he's kind of casting Mr. Wilson's definition of liberty as liberty for those who oppress others, the big business owners, not really the liberty of the actual workers. Finally, he says, we propose on the contrary to extend governmental power in order to secure the liberty of the wage workers, the men and women who toil in industry to save the liberty of the oppressed from the oppressor. Mr. Wilson stands for the liberty of the oppressor to oppress. We stand for the limitation of his liberty, thus to oppress those who are weaker than himself. Alright, so now that we've kind of finished reading the passage, let's move on to the question and answer section. And here I've provided a sample question. So this type of question is actually called an evidence-based question, where you're going to try to find the answer to one question and to find the evidence that backs it up. So in passage 1, Roosevelt suggests that in contrast with people from previous moments in history, contemporary Americans are more likely to A. Be empowered by their democratic republic, B. Know how to secure political capital, C. Seek power through nonviolent protest, and D. Be ruled by giant industry magnates rather than kings. So let's go down the answers and see which answers don't make much sense. In terms of the SAT, there are going to be 2 answers that are way better than the other 2, which are kind of a bit out of the blue. So let's find the 2 that don't fit in this situation. If we look at A, be empowered by their democratic republic, we could go back and look a bit at the passage. So inside the passage, Roosevelt definitely talks a lot about having the people in their own power and taking power away from the big businesses. So A kind of makes sense. But now let's go to B. Know how to secure political capital. And what exactly is political capital? Well, if you don't really know, you could just think of the words politics and capital. So capital is resources you have, and politics obviously refers to how government works. So something with resources and government, that should be going through your head. So during the passage, Mr. Roosevelt mostly criticizes Wilson's ideology, not Wilson's ability to get into the government with the resources that Wilson has. So B is one of the answers you should be eliminating. Next, let's go on to C. Seek power through non-violent protest. If you look through the passage, there isn't really anything about protest. It's mostly an attack on the ideas. Protest, nonviolent protest, is something we will see in other eras of history, but not in this section right here. So let's eliminate C as well. So right now we have A and D. A and D make, well, we haven't checked D yet, right? So D, be ruled by giant industry magnates rather than kings. So in the first paragraph, we see that Roosevelt refers to kings, and later on he'll talk about magnates. So definitely it's inside the passage, so we're keeping D.